Little background on today's gospel. What we had last week was blind Bartimaeus, who was the last miracle that Jesus performed in the Gospel of Mark before coming into his glory in Jerusalem. So now Jesus is there in Jerusalem, and the antagonists are lining up to take him on. He's taking on all comers. So first you have the Pharisees and the Herodians. The Pharisees, again, are those who thought that if they implemented the law in its fullness, that the Messiah would certainly come. The Herodians were those who were kind of live and let live. We've finally had peace after hundreds of years. We finally have peace. We finally have a stable government, live and let live. So they are unlikely partners, but they team up and they say, Jesus, you're so wonderful. You're so intelligent. You're just grand. Oh, by the way, is it allowable to pay the census tax to Caesar? So if he says yes, pay the tax, then a lot of people will walk away because after all, it's a very unpopular tax. If he says no, then the Herodians have a way of saying, look at this guy's a traitor. Then the Sadducees come, and the Sadducees are those who run the temple. They only accept the first 5 books of the Bible. So a lot of the later writings, you get that idea of a resurrection or a future resurrection that you don't get in the first 5 books. So they have a question, a woman marries 7 times. Each of the brothers and each of the husbands dies. When she gets to heaven, is she going to have this big harem? Is she going to choose? Again, just to kind of show in their minds the stupidity of the resurrection. And Jesus takes and again shows them, and instructs them. And then you have the person today. In some of the Gospels, what we have the scribe as being kind of like the divide and conquer. He's testing him because he wants to say, well, that's fine, teacher, but, after all I say, or Rabbi, this person says. But instead, really what we see in the Gospel of Mark is somebody who's testing him because he wants to know, is this guy, from the Galilee, after all, we're from Jerusalem. We're from like the Harvard of the universities. This guy's from the Galilee. That's kind of like a state university. Who's he? So kind of testing him in that way. And so he says, what is the law? How would you describe it? It says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, which is from Deuteronomy. Love your neighbor as yourself, which is from Leviticus. And so he says, you're correct. That's you've spoken correctly. The interesting thing is that he says it's that to love your Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself is worth more than any burnt offerings or sacrifices. And that kind of leads to that question. There was a question posed on this website, Ready to Harvest, and Ready to Harvest had a question: were the people saved by following the law in the Old Testament? And of course, you have the New Testament triumphalists who are like, oh, of course not. Everybody's been saved by Jesus. But the question really that I thought is that did the people who were doing this know that? Were they thinking that they were somehow going to be saved by following the law? Because after all, we think about the law and the importance of following that law. After all, Moses was almost killed by God because he was very delayed in circumcising his son. So he was almost killed by God. So it certainly was important in a way. And I think the one thing about it was that it was, in a way, not a direct way. You see the beginnings of that way of being direct in the book of the prophet Habakkuk, because in Habakkuk, about the 7th century, you have the idea that the just shall live by faith. And then that really kind of begins to grow and blossom in the newer readings of the Old Testament and into the New Testament. But the one thing about it is that for the people back at the time, did they think that they're following the law? And I think I'd have to say yes, because one of the things about it was that instead of the Lord saying it directly, because here were a people who were, although not enslaved in Egypt anymore, were certainly enslaved by their idolatry. So instead of directly saying that the just shall live by faith, instead of directly saying that you're saved by faith, he had to have that law, to have an indirect way of having them come to the conclusion by following the law that indeed that there is to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. So if they followed that law indirectly, they would come to that conclusion to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so rather than being direct because of their idolatry, because of their sinfulness, what the Lord did is went about it indirectly. And so one of the things about it today is that where is it today with us? And certainly you have, these commandments that are very easy to say. Okay, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Very easy to say, but in a way, much harder to do, especially in loving God fully, loving God with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our strength, our neighbor as ourself. Is that possible? I think back there was a priest I know who asked this one Monsignor who was elderly Monsignor, and coming near the point of his death, and he said to him, "Do you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength?" And he's like, getting there, getting better. And I think that that's one thing, if we're honest with ourselves, that's what we'll say. It's easy to say, sometimes harder to do. So we always need to be humble and always need to ask the Lord for that strength to help us to be able to do his commandments and do them well. Thanks and God bless.